This is In Hindsight, half a century of research discoveries in Canadian history, presented by Dr. Donald B. Smith and produced by the Ontario Historical Society.
Our episode today is about a very, very interesting individual, Onondeyoh, or going from Mohawk to English, Fred Loft. Six Nations individual, very, very important figure in the political history of the First Nations in Canada. He was the individual who organized the League of Indians of Canada, the predecessor of the National Indian Brotherhood of the 1970s, the Assembly of First Nations, today's title. An incredible individual. Let's begin at the beginning. 1861, he's born. And in Six Nations territory, his family it was a prosperous family, farming family. And at Six Nations, the basic reality is there are two groups. The Christian, in the late 19th century, this was very strong. There was the Christian community and the Longhouse community, the traditionalists and the Christians. And the Loft family belonged to the Christian family, but they had relatives and acquaintances in the Longhouse faith. And they intermingled. It just really was. There wasn't any unnatural division. They were familiar with the traditional people as well as the Christian of the Christian Iroquois or Haudenosaunee. This family is quite unique. It moves in both circles, and they're quite open. To the larger society, as well as being very proud First Nations people, proud Six Nations people. Well, Loft grew up in this environment. Their home, it was 200 acres, good sized farm. It was called Forest Home. And actually, always please check the text for these episodes, because I'm very blessed to be able to have a picture of Forest Home, and it's color tinted. This is wonderful. That's where the home. So you'll see on the text part an illustration showing where he grew up at Forest Home. It was obtained that, by the way. It's very lucky. This story has got sort of an extra edge to it because I met Fred Loft's daughter, one of his daughters, and also I met a niece of his, a close, who knew him well, and both these women were in their early 90s. It was just like story before the end sort of thing. I was so blessed. So I feel very close to this topic because of his daughter and his niece and good associations. Well, Fred did his schooling in the neighborhood because there was a system. Six Nations were pretty well organized on this front. They had local schools, primary schools, in many sections of the territory. And Fred went to one, which was near the farm. And he was at that school till age 12. Now, these schools, it's quite extraordinary. There's something called the Mohawk Institute. It's an Indian residential school. And the Mohawk Institute, actually, a big positive, they actually trained the teachers for those schools. So he had native teachers. What a big plus. It really made a heck of a difference. The school experience wasn't great, and I'll come to that shortly. But for training these teachers, this gave the First Nations kids really a leg up. And he enjoyed school. As I say, he went to age 12. He was lucky, though. He spoke English already before he went to school because his parents spoke English. And their English was introduced to the family. He had several brothers. They learned English at home, as well as speaking Mohawk. Mohawk was their native language, and nevertheless, they were bilingual. So he did well at school. Now, his parents, why not Mohawk Institute? So he applied, and they applied, and he was accepted. So he went to residential school in Brantford, at Mohawk Institute. Now, already his brother, he went for 1 year and he detested it. It was a bad experience. I'd like to introduce you to that because here's a very reasonable chap who really he found it just a terrible place. Now, mind you, where he's coming from. He's coming from his family is very supportive. He's allowed the Six Nations way of childhood educations so different than the non-Indigenous. They were allowed uh, responsibilities, able to make their own decisions. Fred is a boy. He loved to train wild horses, train horses that had never been ridden. I mean, the parents, this is fine. I mean, he's allowed freedom at school. No way. The Mohawk Institute, oh, well, sure, the primary school is fine. But when he gets to the Mohawk Institute, this is boot camp. It was the regimentation, the lack of imagination. This was despicable for him. He did this horribly unimaginative approach to education. So that didn't impress him at all. But more than that was the food. The food was terrible. And the cold at night in the winter. My gosh. He later records this. He said, like, sometimes I'd be up half the night before I could sleep because I was so cold. Well, Fred went back home well, he's not far from home, but anyways, after 1 year at this place, that was it. And he told his parents that, and they were supportive. I mean, that's just for a different society. We are so the Christian Haudenosaunee, I mean, they're still First Nations people. They're totally different. Their education is not part of the script. And anyways, his parents listened to him, and they respected his opinion. That's fine. Well, don't go back. Well, so, but Fred wasn't finished yet. He wanted to get an education. He didn't want to go to that place, that's all. So what he did was, and this is extraordinary for a young man of, 13, 14, whatever, very, very young guy, he decided he was going to walk to school in Caledonia, a neighboring non-Indigenous community right by the Six Nations territory. It was a 15-kilometer round trip, and he did that. So off he goes there and prepares whatever preparation was necessary for high school, for about a year's study, I think. But he's doing this by, quotation marks, commuting by foot, and was able to apply to high school in Caledonia and was accepted. Now, then at that point, he moves to Caledonia and he boards there. How does he pay for that? Well, he gets odd jobs, and it's just he supports himself, and he gets his high school. He gets a high school. High school education. This is so rare. So I think you've got enough background here to know this man is determined, and he has. He wants to succeed in every respect and fulfill himself. At this point, I don't think he knew exactly where he was going to end up, but he did get that high school education, which he felt was essential. Now, there was discrimination. Oh, there's discrimination now, let's be real. But then it was even rougher. But Fred, he was self-reliant. His family, his parents were totally supportive, and he knew he was good at school. My good, he was good, all right. He went right through, with paying for his own education and all. And this discrimination inevitably he'd encounter it. But in the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, there is, amongst the chiefs, there's a saying that when you meet adversity and sort of a rough stage of life and all, somebody's bothering you, discriminating against you, or bullying you, or something of that sort, Haudenosaunee, the saying was, you had to have a skin 7 thumbs thick. Well, Fred did. He got through this. This was these irritations, let's call them that. Okay, time to get a job. So Fred leaves high school, wants to make some money, becomes a lumberjack, and did well. He rose right up. This was in the forest in northern Michigan. Rose up from lumberjack to timber inspector. But ill health forced him to think of something else. And he applied and got a scholarship to the Ontario Business College. So already you see the wheels are turning. He's got this, he's going to follow this up. And he goes to Belleville, Ontario, studies accounting, and gets his degree. Another extraordinary development for a First Nations person in the late 19th century. Well, unfortunately, he couldn't get a job as an accountant. So disappointment, not at this stage. Eventually he would, but not initially. So he could write. He became a journalist for the Brantford Expositor. And in those days, the First Nations, well, because of Johnny MacDonald, those that met the property qualification, those that had who were easy and who knew English or French, and also had shown that they'd adopted to the larger society, they could vote in the federal elections. And so there's a political aspect to this. When Fred's with the Expositor, he's a liberal. And that's great because out of that association, Fred gets the provincial Liberals give him a job after the journalist experience. He gets a job at the bursar's office. Now, where he got the job is kind of bizarre, but he was employed as an accountant at the Asylum for the Insane in Toronto. Isn't that terrible? 999 Queen Street. That's where he'd worked for 30 years as an accountant. And anyways, with a job, and well, the inmates actually had the First Nations had under the Indian Act had they had the same number of civil rights as the people in the Asylum for the Insane, 0. They weren't regarded as citizens, and this is so that's sort of ironic, but so it was but Fred, it was a government job, and he paid the bills, so that was good because he had lots of interests. He liked Toronto. He was there, and he was in the militia. He was a Mason. He loved sports, and he liked writing. Did articles and stuff. He had been a journalist for a bit there, and so he did well. He met a woman, Alpha Greer, 11 years younger. She actually was living in Chicago, but was visiting Toronto. She had Canadian roots, and they fell in love. There was a 11-year difference between them, but didn't matter. Sort of like the earlier episode of Nani and her husband, William Sutton. They had an age difference, but they got along extremely well. And Alpha and Fred did as well. They had 3 daughters. One fortunately died young, but 2 lived to adulthood. And I had the good fortune to meet one of his daughters, Alpha. Well, first glance, you'd think, you try to do the what I call what full meal deal. You try to do everything. I checked the directories for Toronto, and the lofts moved so frequently. I didn't understand this. They're nomadic. What's going on here? Well, I'll tell you the secret. Fred's job didn't pay. It was okay, but it wasn't paying super well. And so Alpha made money for the family they would buy houses, sort of fix them all up, and then they sell them or rent them. And this is how the extra cash came in. They lived a comfortable life. Alpha and Fred had an upper middle class life in Toronto, thanks to her extra income. And they had season tickets to 2 theaters. They participated in organizations, Fred's and the Masons. Alpha's in the American Women's Club, the Women's Art Association, and the United Emperor Loyalists, participating there. And so they had quite a life. Now, they didn't lose the Six Nations touch. No, they're living, well, Fred would visit regularly because his mother was still living, and his brothers. So he'd go back, and I had good fortune of meeting a relative of his that remembered. She was Ella Montour. She remembered, this is about 30 years ago, mind you, but she remembered seeing her uncle at church because Fred would always visit the Anglican church. He loved to practice his Mohawk when he went back home. And at the church, Ella Montour Klaus, she remembers that, well, Fred, he certainly knew Mohawk, but he hadn't spoken it. He wouldn't just speak it hardly ever. I mean, gosh, but back at the church he's able to. And she noticed he put Mohawk words in the wrong places on occasion. So totally understandable. Ella remembers too, the family would go to the church. They were elegantly dressed. They were well spoken. Well, this is enough to make Fred, I mean, listen now, he's been working there. He's been working off the territory for about 2 decades now, and he's fluent in English. His wife is not Indigenous. Why not enfranchise and get full civil rights? So he considers it. He's going to enfranchise. And that, again, is the phrase has to be explained. And we've talked about it before in previous episodes, but I'll just quick run again. Enfranchisement means you give up your Indian status, you cease to be under the Indian Act, and you become a full citizen. Now, that because of the circumstances, Fred's not in any way saying he doesn't want to be an Indian anymore or whatever. I mean, it's not that. It's simply for advantages and making life much easier for him if he did. So he considers it. The Six Nations Council hears about this, and they head him off at the pass. No, don't do that, please. Instead, why not apply to become the head dog? Why not be the Indian Affairs, the chief man of Indian Affairs at the Six Nations territory? Become That's what you should do, Fred, and we'll support you. And so he does. But unfortunately, let's be realistic. Unfortunately, this is the last thing that Indian Affairs wants, is to have an accountant as charge of Indian affairs in the territory. The last thing. Fred doesn't have a chance. I think we used to say a snowball's chance in hell of getting this job. And he didn't. But anyways, it's a compliment that the Six Nations Council would consider him. He would be their candidate to be in charge of the operation in the Six Nations territory. But it was not to be. So, back to developments. Toronto, they're living an upper middle class life, he and Alpha, but then the war comes. Now we're into the horrible World War I, and we'll get touches of that actually in a future episode in the story of Fred Albright, who's a Calgarian who enlists. We'll get that. It's coming. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible situation. And Fred feels strongly about it. He feels strongly because Britain was the Six Nations ally. They weren't subjects of Britain. They were allies. And he wanted to support Britain, so much so that he reduced his age from 56 to 45 in order to enlist. He was in great shape. He got right by he always walked. He took care of himself and exercised daily. He was in great shape, and he passed the physical, and he had militia experience, so he was made an officer. And he was assigned to the Canadian Forestry Corps in Europe and went overseas. There's a great picture of him with the Corps, and that's another photo. I was able to obtain that from Alpha. Alpha had that. Just let me copy it. So it's in the textual version of this episode. The Six Nations supported him too, and he was named a Pine Tree Chief. That is, so a Pine Tree Chief was one who was not a hereditary chief, but had the rights to appearing at the Six Nations Council. It was a great honor. So Fred was he was being supported fully. Now, after the war, Fred decides that something's missing here. The First Nations just are not getting the support that they need, and they're not participating as fully as they might have. Their sovereignty is not being respected. There's several issues that are really bothering him, and it's not just the Six Nations, it's First Nations groups across Canada. So he sets out to do something about it and founds the League of Indians of Canada. This is his big contribution. This is in 1918, late 1918, at the Six Nations. The first meeting is held actually in that wonderful historic council house at Ohsweken, the capital, if you will, of the Six Nations on the Six Nations territory. The League is founded, and Fred, his greatest ally, is the typewriter. He has no money. He's putting this League of Indians of Canada is supported by him out of his own pocket. Really, there's no government funding. There's nothing of that sort. It's all Fred. But he knows how to, business college, remember, and he's worked in the office for several decades. He has a typewriter. So he contacts groups right across Canada. Several conferences are held, and the progressive agenda is advanced. The major aspect is education. This is so contemporary. First Nations must be given an equal chance. They must be given full support with their educational programs. And it's a very progressive agenda. In fact, so progressive that a number of missionaries supported it. In fact, out here in Alberta, they had an Alberta wing to this, and they're strong in Saskatchewan. The League of Indians of Canada was making progress, and missionaries, the Catholic missionary in the Pecuni Reserve here in southern Alberta, he collected money for the League of Indians of Canada. And boy, when Duncan Campbell Scott, who now is the Grand Poobah of Indian Affairs, he's Deputy Superintendent General, and we'll talk about him in the next episode. So again, I have to just keep it short on him. Well, he's so opposed, and he regards Fred Loft as diabolical. Fred Loft, he's Duncan Campbell Scott at this point, and please, I don't want to I have my chance to do him in the next episode, but I don't want to just make him the center of it all. This is a mentality of an age. He's just the chief representative of it. He's applying the assimilationist policy, and he wants to introduce compulsory enfranchisement. That is, people like Fred Loft are, by the decision of the department, selected to be enfranchised. They don't choice. There's no choice in it. They're just enfranchised. That a bill actually reaches Parliament in 1920, and it's to get rid of people like Fred Loft, remove their Indian status. So, well, anyways, change of government, and the bill passed, but the Conservatives were out of power. The Liberals withdrew that, and so compulsory enfranchisement was not introduced in 1922. However, Fred Loft's problems are not over. There's a terrific opposition to him from Duncan Campbell Scott. In fact, well, I just want to quote the Toronto Star, 28th of August, 1920. It quoted Fred Loft as saying, "If anything is responsible for the backwardness of the Indians today, it is the domineering, dictating, vetoing method of the Indian Department. The position and treatment of the Indian today is as if he were an imbecile." Isn't that quote? It says it all. He's working at the insane asylum. He knows all that. He knows how those people are treated. He knows about the Indian Department, and he's actually met Duncan Campbell Scott at one point, domineering, dictating, vetoing. Well, Scott is just showing red to a bull. He's absolutely furious, and he's got to deal with him because, well, he does all he can to oppose it, trying to sabotage the league. But anyways, he gets a break because Fred's wife, Afa, Fred's wife is ill in the mid-20s, and he resigns from his position in the Ontario Civil Service, and he and Afa go to Chicago, and he's there for 4 years. So that really takes the wind out of the sails. And by the time Fred comes back, so much is the spirit of the league is gone, and of course there's no financing except basically just him, and several of the key players have had to withdraw themselves, and it's the beginning of the Depression. So it's just no. The league is pretty well kaput. But the contribution was made. He planted the seeds. Well, Fred had one last hurrah. That was to go to the Privy Council in London, the supreme legal body of the British Empire, and present the position of the First Nations of Canada and point out the injustices. And he began to raise a bit of money for this trip. It was going to cost a good amount of money, and sent out letters to that effect. Duncan Campbell Scott, still in power, hears about this, and in 1927, the Indian Act was changed, and it was made illegal to raise money for Indian land claims. It is 1927. That remains in for a generation, by the way, that rule. So they can't. This is regarded by Scott as subversive, and Loft can be persecuted under this new provision, and he's prepared to do so, but he doesn't, because Fred Loft, by the early 1930s, he doesn't get the financial support he needs. Unfortunately, money's not forthcoming. It's the beginning of the Depression. And secondly, his health is terrible. So it doesn't happen. And Fred Loft's health, precarious. By the 1934, he dies. And there he goes. There goes a man who's made such a contribution, who stood up, just in the same spirit that he left at the residential school. His family, he had such a good background at home, and he took from the educational system what he needed. He went to school in Caledonia, a business college. I mean, he redressed this situation very well, and with his personality, his wife Alpha helped too. I mean, great support there. All these factors came together to lead to the foundation of the League of Indians of Canada, which certainly can be regarded as a predecessor of the National Indian Brotherhood of the 1970s, and eventually the Assembly of First Nations in the 1980s. The Assembly of First Nations is still, of course, very much in existence. So Fred Loft, really a visionary for First Nations political organization, and certainly deserves to be well remembered today. Next episode, Duncan Campbell Scott, Fred Loft's nemesis.